to self-introduce myself. I'm Trevor Darrell. I'm one of the co-instructors of this class and also today's guest lecturer. Welcome to 249-131. And maybe we should just start by seeing if there's any administrative issues or questions. I think Colleen's been on top of most things so far this term. Anyone have any issues or registration questions or project questions? One thing we wanted to add was a suggestion that if you're interested for your project, there's this iClear reimplementation challenge. The timing, I think, aligns pretty well with the course project. Colleen, do you want to say anything about that, what we know about it?
So this is run by Montreal and McGill. You pick a paper that's submitted to iClear, and you re-implement it and try to reproduce the results. I don't know if they've officially announced the challenge this year yet. It might be announced sometime in September. But you can look at last year's. It seemed pretty successful, and it's a way to kind of make the community more robust in the kind of things that we accept in conferences.
So any issues or questions so far about the process of the course? I think John introduced it last week. I'm here this week. Next week I'm off at ECCV, so I'll be away, but then I will hope to make most of the sessions after that. Okay, so part of this term we're going to have a few more Berkeley talks than we've had in previous years. There's a lot of great work going on at Berkeley, and we want to expose it to all of you. And you're going to have, I think, 3 sessions that focus on work in my group. First, today I'm going to be presenting some of the most exciting things that are going on, especially focusing on adaptive deep learning and explainable AI and explainable deep learning, and I'll explain what that means as this talk goes forward. Next week, I think Colleen is going to present deep learning and robotics and a variety of both now classic and cutting-edge techniques on end-to-end visuomotor control. And then towards the end of the month, Dr. Fisher-Yu, who's affiliated with my group, will come and present state-of-the-art in deep learning for autonomous driving, state-of-the-art architectures for visual recognition, and large-scale annotation, and probably whatever else he wants to talk about. So today, let's dive in. I'm going to focus on adaptation and vision and language, and especially vision and language as it relates to explainable AI. And everyone in this class has, let me see if I can get this to work. Everyone, the prereqs for this class are you understand basic deep learning. So I assume you know, there we go. So you know the state of things in AI and deep learning, probably. Probably any of us could brief this slide saying it's an exciting time to be a researcher in AI. There's lots of things that are starting to work in AI. We have models for playing video games. We have systems that can beat humans at chess. We have exciting new robotic architectures, algorithms, autonomous driving, and so on and so forth. The future is great. Everyone's like overwhelmed with how much progress we're making. But if you really look at it, we've only just started to scratch the surface. And in many domains where you have complicated interaction with people, massive scale and noisy environments, and complicated long-term uncertain environments, AI isn't that impressive yet. And the things that we have that work on the left side of this chart don't always carry out and work on the right-hand side of this chart. So I think you'll see through this, through the lectures in this course, the state-of-the-art and the current areas of research, especially those at Berkeley and the top labs around the world, really focus on pushing AI from that kind of clean, neat, simulated environment where everything is reasonably controlled and we have lots of data to train on, to areas where things aren't so clean and simple, where we have to learn from small amounts of data, we have to generalize into new domains, we have to deal with issues of trust with users, both understanding users and gaining their trust, and so on and so forth. So this is often called meta deep learning or deep learning to learn, and there are lots of cool topics that are very interesting, and there's sort of 4 broad areas illustrated on this slide. I'm only going to really talk about 2 or 2.5 of them. This first one that I'm going to focus on is adapting to new domains and tasks. I'll go into that into some detail. Then a whole related field. So this is the problem statement of what do you do when your testing environment is different from your training environment. You show up in a new place and suddenly your models don't work. How do you use unlabeled data in your test environment to do better? There's a whole lot of work on self-supervised learning and curious learning. I'm not sure that we may have a speaker that comes in later and talks about that, but that's how in static recognition, how do we learn visual representations without supervision, just by, for example, in-painting tasks, which I can define from unlabeled data, or in an RL setting, what can I do without any reward, just with, for example, curiosity. What I will talk about today are some of the topics at the bottom here, which are how do we bring compositionality to deep learning, a notion of modularity, and in particular modularity that then gives us some interpretability or explainability. And then last, even beyond imposing structural explainability or interpretability onto a model, can we still adopt essentially a justification or storytelling approach to explainability? And what is that like, and what are the pros and cons of those approaches? So first we're going to jump right in and start with adaptation. So we all know and love contemporary AI machinery, especially supervised learning, especially deep learning. We can easily recognize cats and dogs and all sorts of other categories on the internet. And as you all know, the story goes like this. We train it with some massive data set, have a convolutional network architecture, do backpropagation from some loss, for example, a cross-entropy loss between the label and the output of this network, and it works very well. I get a dog, it will tell me it's a dog. Right, it'll still work well, won't it, if I then just take this video and put it in and ask if there's a dog in the video. How many people think this is going to work really well? How many people think it's not going to work really well? You all are experienced in deep learning. You must have tried it yourself. Somehow your mileage may vary, and just because I have frames from this video that you would think if I had 99 or 95% performance on the static image classifier, I actually take frame, you believe what the marketing hype of deep learning is telling us, that we've, have human level performance on recognizing ImageNet classification tasks and so on and so forth. But then you go out in the real world and half the time this stuff just doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? What's going on? Well, in this case, we have certainly trained a model that can recognize dogs, but it can't recognize dogs in this video. And the reason is very straightforward. These models do exactly what you tell them to, especially these supervised deep learning methods. And here we've told it to learn to recognize dogs on the internet. And so here are images of the dog class from ImageNet. And the model is quite good at this. And then what we asked it to do was to go recognize dog images in a video, or frames taken from a video. And indeed, well, to me they look like dogs, and to you they look like dogs, and they are dogs, but to the current state-of-the-art of algorithms that we have in computer vision, they're not dogs. And that's the whole point of this, this line of work and this lecture. When you tell a human to recognize dogs, and you give dog training data like this to a human, excuse me, humans don't get confused. If you've said, here, these are examples of dogs, or if I told you these are examples of blicks, right? And I said, go find some more blicks. You wouldn't get confused if I gave you a black and white image of a blick, or if I gave you a video with blicks moving around in it. The vision system that you have evolved and learned to use generalizes across all these natural viewing conditions. And that's something that we don't have yet for state-of-the-art, that's the current cutting edge, is how do we have machine vision systems that have the same level of generalization capability, right? So that when I give you an example of a category like this, it'll be recognized despite the kinds of viewing conditions and sensor variation and pose variety that we expect in the real world. And since we're in the modern era, we want to learn to do this. In the old days, actually, we still had these same problems. And the way we handled them was to design features that were invariant to the kinds of transformations that we expected to encounter out in the real world, the things that would differ between the lab setting where we might be training all of our models and the real world where we go out and test all of our models. So I don't want to like roll the clock back and go back to hand-engineered feature spaces. So what can we do? How can we actually keep using machine learning, but further have a learning-based approach to generalizing to new environments, a learning-based approach to this challenge? And the broad field here is often called domain adaptation. It's not a new problem. It's not even a problem that arose after deep learning. This has been around for quite a while, and this was a classic problem for models prior to deep learning and still with contemporary deep learning methods. Deep learning methods actually do better on domain adaptation than previous methods, but you still have a domain adaptation problem even with a deep learning approach. So the problem statement is what I've already outlined. You might be training on some data, ImageNet, or you like images, scraped from the internet, or you might have product images that have pretty idiosyncratic backgrounds and poses, or you might have a synthetic world, and in fact you'd like to test on videos instead of stills, or images from a noisy mobile camera that's flying around the environment compared to these clean product images. Or I might have training data that's from a synthetic virtual environment, like a driving simulator, and I'd like to actually make sure it works on real cameras on real cars in the real world. So that's what we're going to do today. That's domain adaptation. And we're specifically interested in the setting. I mean, I think it should be obvious. We care about the setting when we don't have tons of labels in the target domain. Actually, if you have tons of labels in the target domain, what should you do? This is sort of a trivial question. What do you do if you actually have a lot of labels in the target domain? How do you solve this problem? Yeah, ignore the source domain, right? If you have infinite amounts of training data, forget about the source domain, just train in the target domain. So it only matters if you care about the few shot case, or you care about the case where you're not going to have your car stop and relabel all of the objects in the scene when you get into a new weather condition or something like that. You don't want the human driver to actually label pixels in their new autonomous car. And it's most interesting to say, what can we do in the unlabeled in this unsupervised domain adaptation setting, which means I'm going to assume no labels at all in the target domain. What can we do? I mean, do you think we can do anything? I wouldn't be giving this talk if the answer was no, right? So we will get there, but it might, at first glance, sometimes people say, oh, you can't do anything if you don't have any labels, but you can, and that's where we'll go. And in fact, there's several broad paradigms of how people have tackled domain adaptation over the years. And three are illustrated here. We're going to be pursuing the third one, but just for the sake of completeness, let's think about the first two. Feature augmentation, right? If you know you're going to have a certain transformation, like the color is going to vary, or your sensor might change resolution, or Sometimes objects are going to be horizontal and sometimes they're vertical. One of the simplest ideas in domain adaptation is to take your source data and transform it automatically so that it has that variation kind of baked into it. So if you know all of your training data are upright images of faces, but you know out in the real world faces might come at different, in-plane rotations, well, it's well known that you could take all your training data, rotate it, and add that back in, or train a separate model for each viewpoint, and that works well. But that requires knowing ahead of time what modes of variation or what kinds of invariances you'd like to overcome as you adapt to a new domain. It's sort of like if you already know the problem, that's a solution to it. And of course, we're interested in the case where you don't know ahead of time what surprising new domain that you're going to encounter. The second great idea is bootstrapping or self-ensembling. And that basically says I have a source detector. I can probably detect some of my objects in the target. So let's do that and then add that into my training set. This is also a good idea and is one of the older techniques. But you can only take it with a grain of salt. You can only do so much of it, right? You're eventually probably going to drift off the concept that you care about. And so in practice, models for bootstrapping usually have some sort of governor on them or some sort of constraint that says do a little bit of it, but don't do too much of it, at least until a human checks that you're not kind of sliding off into some completely new space. So the techniques that we've been working on in my lab here at Berkeley are in this category of distribution alignment or transformation-based approaches. And these don't require any a priori knowledge of what's going to happen before it happens, and they don't have this issue of concept drift. So what is this idea of distribution alignment? So and here's sort of the classic take on this distribution alignment idea. I've got some task that I'm trying to perform here. I'm trying to recognize bottles and mugs, for example. I'm going to learn a source representation, I'm going to learn representation, and then it's going to give me some feature vectors, and then I'm going to build a classifier and make decisions. This slide, could have been pre-deep learning, right? And how do I know that there's a problem, or what might become apparent just at this level? Right? So if I train this model to perform that classification task, what difference might I see here? Do you think the distribution of these features is going to look the same for the source and for the target? Probably not. I mean, like, these images look really different. So just with a normal representation, there'll probably be some difference. And so here's the core idea underlying this whole theme of approaches. You really don't want there to be a distribution difference in the representation that you're making a decision on. Right? If I'd like to be blind to the things that I shouldn't care about or that aren't important between two different domains. Right? So I'd like to actually, in the representation that I'm making a decision on, I'd like to not have any discrepancy or divergence between the distribution of the unlabeled data. So that's the key idea. Can we you have a learning-based approach to learn a representation that can't distinguish the domains, right? So now we're going to have a ConvNet as our representation, and we're going to, well, of course, we're going to solve a task, right? So there'll be some loss from this task that's going to propagate through and help learn the representation. This is just like ImageNet training or whatever your actual task is. But now we're going to have some other loss that's going to come from this distribution discrepancy. So I'm going to basically take all the data and look at this distribution from the source and from the target and see, you know, are they lining up? Are there, you know, if I plot the data, are there means in the same spot? Or more generally, can I minimize the discrepancy? So early versions of these algorithms would basically look at means or kernelized mean differences in the distributions of these two sets of vectors. You can have higher order alignment models, not just aligning the means, but the moments, second order moments and higher moments. And then ultimately some notion of discrepancy, which is measuring the distance between the two bounds. And there's a nice sort of sidebar here, a connection to some literature in the theory community, which gives you a bound based on the discrepancy, which is defined here, of these two distributions. And we can then actually say the target error is going to be bounded by the source error plus the discrepancy plus a somewhat complicated term that's related to the error of the best model and so on and so forth. So this theory is actually inspirational. I'm not sure these bounds are tight enough to be too useful in practice, but they do motivate this general approach of minimizing the discrepancy between the unlabeled distribution of target points and the corresponding unlabeled distribution. Well, actually, it's a labeled distribution of source points. And so there's been a series of techniques for minimizing that discrepancy by looking at the means or the moments of the distribution. And then in the last several years, state-of-the-art approach to solving this task actually went one step further. It said, forget about just aligning kind of the overall statistics between these two distributions. What's the sort of strongest, at least contemporary technique that I could apply to saying, to answer the question, can I tell the difference between points from this distribution and points from that distribution? Well, it's actually to throw a convnet at it, right? Or a deep net. Can I actually train a deep network that looks at samples and can predict whether it comes from this distribution or that distribution? And this sort of adversarial approach grew up in parallel to the GAN literature. It grew up in this domain adaptation literature under the notion of adversarial adaptation. But it turns out to be basically very similar. So how can I optimize adversarially something to say, is this a source or a target sample? I mean, I don't have any labels, do I? So do I have any labels with which I can train this? I told you I don't have any task labels. So I don't have any labels. Do I? Which is it? Who wants to say I have some labels? Where do I have labels?
I mean, you do know whether it's source or target.
Exactly. You do know whether it's source or target. So actually, we just use straightforward supervised learning. So this version of unsupervised domain adaptation still actually is supervised. I mean, whenever you get into unsupervised or self-supervised, the terminology, there's no clean terminology anymore, right? So here we're saying unsupervised domain adaptation. That means I have no task labels in the target, but I do actually assume that I have domain labels for the purposes of these papers. And so it is actually, we're just going to use supervised learning to train this adversarial classifier. We could actually imagine a problem statement where I don't even have domain labels, where images are being sent to me and I don't know which sensor they're coming from or which domain they're from. That's pretty unusual. So here we get the advantage of being able to do supervised learning in this inner loop of adversarial loss in the same way that a GAN does. The GANs know whether a source is whether the discriminator is being given a real image or an image from the generator, and it tries to predict real or fake. Here we have a domain classifier that's being given samples from the representation operating on the source data or on the target data, and we train a classifier to predict one way or the other, and then we use the inverse loss on that classifier to go back and update the representation. Okay, so let's look at a cartoon version of this. Bottles and mugs again. Could train a classifier to do this. This is like notional hyperplanes, more reminiscent of SVMs, but it still gets the point across even in a deep learning, even with a convnet as the core representation. So I'm trying to classify mugs from bottles. Easy to do, let's just assume. But then I get a bunch of new data from a new sensor labeled with blue boundaries because it's in a different domain. And if I just took that representation that I learned over here, I'd get them all wrong because the intra-class variation is dominated by the intra-domain variation. So just like in a classic metric learning approach, except this is sort of all basically metric learning except at a distributional level, right? I don't have, and in fact the precursor papers to all of these works did explore metric learning, which is to say if I know here's an image of this mug in this domain and the same mug in that domain, well, let's just create an optimization that aligns these two things. We rarely have that for many of the problem statements that we care about. So all of this adversarial and discrepancy-based approach is basically imposing the same idea without pairwise constraints, just optimizing at a distributional level, saying, wow, can I figure out how to minimize this discrepancy? Well, yep, I can train a classifier, a domain classifier. Easy peasy, I can classify those blue boxes from those red boxes. Okay, now let's sort of flip the loss and try and make it harder for that classifier, update the underlying representations so that these things come closer and closer together. And notionally, you'd get something like this, which would be quite nice, because the original task classifier would still work well and generalize better in this environment. And that's both what the underlying theory that I referenced earlier suggests would be the case under some assumptions, and in practice what we see many times. I mean, it's not perfect. There's still work here. Sometimes these things, just like a GAN, sometimes it converges, sometimes it doesn't. We're still a little bit in that realm. Was there a question?
Yeah, it seems like this works well if you're just doing the binary distinction between cups and mugs or whatever, but in the general vision case, we might be interested in what's the background and what's the pose and the lighting. And do you see this as a general problem if you're aligning these features and you've thrown away all that information? Is that a general problem with this approach? Or
I think it is, and we'll show you lots of other examples besides mugs and cups. Like, I don't think anything I've said so far depends on the task loss. I could be doing semantic segmentation, as I will in a moment, or I could be doing depth inference. I think probably there's a little bit of a hidden assumption that, like, how do you know to not, I'm a little worried that if I don't have the class loss at training, I might optimize out something that would be relevant for a future task. I don't think we've solved that problem completely. Any other questions while we're here? One and then two.
Yeah, how do you relate the confusion of your adversarial classifier to the actual distributional discrepancy between your target and your source examples? Like, at the end of the day, you're trying to match the distributions for the target and the source, right? And you're trying
to tell them apart adversarially. When you at some point when you get to the optimal setting, your classifier can't predict the domain label.
Yeah. So my question is, when you have a classifier that can't predict the domain label, how does that relate to actually truly having the same distributions? It doesn't always mean that they're necessarily the same, right? But do you have any kinds of guarantees there, or mappings, or?
We don't have any theory guarantees there. Just as I said, it's kind of inspired by theory from that I cited before. I think what it means is, given the ConvNet architecture that you've, given the architectural assumptions that are in the discriminator, the distributions are aligned. Whatever. There may be some residual discrepancy that the representation can't perceive. But it's the strongest model we have for being adversarial. One more?
Why don't we just train over data from the target domain instead of having like?
Because we don't have labels in the target domain. We don't have task labels in the target domain. Okay, that was an easy question. Good.
So in this case, what we're doing is that we're trying to maximize accuracy in the source domain and at the same time trying to minimize the distribution discrepancy rate. But we're sort of just hoping that that would also, like, if we're trying to just maximize the confusion of the discriminators, do we have any kind of guarantees that the two domains will fit together nicely?
Probably the answer is just no. But I mean, there is that theory that I alluded to earlier. So this is still, it's like saying, do we have any guarantees that a GAN will converge? I mean, there are a lot of people who write theories about GANs, but I don't know, it still seems hard. This is a bit of an experiment. I'm giving you more of an experimentalist perspective. But I think those questions are good ones for the future and the present, actually. But right now, yeah, maybe, and I also want to I'll take one more and then I want to keep going.
Wouldn't it be common that you wouldn't have access to the target domain during training time? So what would you do in that case?
No, the problem statement here, I think both are common problem statements. One problem statement is your vehicle's deployed in a new environment like Mars, or it's landing on some beach somewhere, and unlabeled data is plentiful. And as long as these adaptation algorithms aren't too computationally burdensome, and that's actually a big if, and I would say that's sort of half true for the algorithms I'm presenting today. It can just cogitate in the field and update its representation just based on unlabeled data. So usually the problem statement is unlabeled data is cheap, and we do have a little bit of computation to fine-tune or retrain in the field without any human intervention. But it's also useful to say, can I solve the problem that even before I get deployed, I'd like to have the most robust representation as possible, even before I see any unlabeled data. I might just suddenly have to start, hitting the ball even before I get a large amount of unlabeled data. And I'm not going to talk about that. That's often called domain generalization or meta-learning generally. And I don't know whether someone is going to present MAML this term, but there are cool methods that have come out of Berkeley that speak to that. So we optimize that. And so that's the full story on your. So far I've told you that we're going to do this in representation space. And do I have the result slides on that? I think I have result slides on that. But then the most recent version of this idea that was actually just presented at ICML in 2018, but was on archive last year, is to not only do this in some kind of feature space, quote unquote, at the top of a convnet, but to simultaneously do it at the pixel level and in some feature space level. And then this connects with image transformation methods that are powerful and easy to visualize and cool. So here you can visualize what it would look like. So now we're doing it at the pixel level and at the feature level. Here you can imagine so this is just a visualization of two different domains. So we can have street view house numbers, and we can have MNIST digits. That's what actual samples from the two domains look like. But you can ask this algorithm, please, let's imagine, and if you just train on one and test on the other, it's like arbitrarily bad, right? If you train, MNIST classification is like solved, quote unquote, but it's not solved, and you can get very poor performance if you take a stock model and train on street view digits and then try and test on MNIST digits. But what isn't so bad is to hallucinate what would the MNIST version of these digits be using this kind of alignment paradigm? Let's basically imagine, or actually this is more a transfer paradigm. This is, let's imagine what this 5 would look like as an MNIST digit, and now use that as supervision. So here we have training data that would have come from synthesized MNIST digits, originally from Street View house numbers digits, and we follow this adversarial approach. And you can see the performance is pretty good. So Oracle performance, I mean, this is like the best of times and the worst of times slide, or this is sort of half full and half empty depending on your perspective. So like, it's a solved task, 99.2% performance if you get target labels for MNIST. And it's like almost a complete failure if you happened to be given Street View house numbers training data as your digit training data. And so this is sort of the progress of the field, and our current numbers are here, which are maybe 3/4 of the way, kind of regaining the gap. And there's still a pretty big gap, right? So it's the good part of that is it's still good to be a researcher, right? Because when that goes up to here, now we're done. And actually in deep learning right now, sometimes it's irritating. Like you get your teeth sunk into a problem, the performance is like 50%, and then it goes to like 98% in like 8 weeks in the field, right? And that's no fun either, because then you're out of a job in that, and you have to start finding another data set and so on and so forth. Yeah?
Wait, so going back to the cups and bottles, it would basically be taking the target images, subtracting out the copy table with the light source, and replacing it with a white background, and trying to...
Except having a fully automated method that learned that was the transformation to do, and doing it in a feature space.
Any examples for the turning Street View house numbers into MNIST digits?
We have that. I don't have it in my slides.
I mean, just the slide you showed, like the previous slide. You had some...
I think I had from Street View to MNIST, but not the other way around.
Sorry, that's what I meant to say. But I was wondering, like, just in the examples, there are features of the digits that I wouldn't think, so there's holes in like the 8 and the 5. Right?
Yeah, so that's not, this is sort of circa 2017 quality pix-to-pix or GAN model. Okay. If you just look at the state of the art of those models in the last 18 months or a year, it probably should just get better. I think if we just put more GAN juice and like progressive mumble, hinge, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, okay.
So this is clearly not, so maybe we'll get that last 10% just by solving this problem. I think there's some other, I'm not sure that would be the case. All right, I'm actually going to run out of time, so this is fun. And I really enjoy this interactive, you guys are asking great questions. I'm sure almost everyone knows about fully convolutional nets and semantic segmentation. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Good. If you don't, ask your neighbor. Can you tell me if this is ground truth, or can you tell me what data set this is, what algorithm it is, and whether it's ground truth or inference? You know it's Kitty. You know it's a fully convolutional network. You know it's predicting the labels. But is it ground truth or is it inference? Is that actually test data or ground truth? I mean, it's blurry. You're far away from it. I'll zoom in for you to help you out. What do you think? See, it's impressive that you can't tell right off the bat, right? But this was done in Germany. Those labelers, it's perfect, okay? They're paid to label each pixel right. These are not perfect. This is actually inference. Right? This is the actual result on a held out image. But at first glance, it looks a little too good, right? Although, there's an error there, and there's an error there, and I don't know if that's an error. And the way in fact, when I was looking at the slide, when I was first giving this slide, I also was like, is it? I can't remember. It's really embarrassing when you're a professor giving a talk and you say, well, here's the result of our algorithm, and someone says, Professor, that's actually ground truth data, But the ground truth, I don't think anybody would annotate the reflections of people in the hood. in this image, right? So that always is kind of a salient point that it's the actual method. So look, supervised performance in domain, train on the data set, test on the data set, have enough labels. This is the deep learning happiness story. Everything's great. We've solved autonomous driving. Let's go cash the check. Oh, except you then take another picture from another place and run, like, I'm just going to, instead of a nice German car driving through small, medium-sized German cities, I'm going to just take a picture from a dash cam in San Francisco and run the exact same code on it. And that's what I get. Now that looks like a computer vision result, right? Right, that's what the lab looks like these days. What's going on? Why do I have like a car floating over here and really very loose sign definition and all this crap happening down here? Any ideas? This is what the source domain looks like, and this is what source model performance looks like in the target domain. And honestly, just pay attention to the underlying image. Here's an image of the source domain. Here's an image of the target domain. Does it really look different? Like, as a human observer, you would both say those are street scenes, right? So as educated deep learning researchers, when you see this, why would you think it's not working?
Maybe different resolutions.
Could be.
Frame rates.
It doesn't look blurry, though. You had an idea?
I mean, I'm just questioning why I would recognize the street as a car.
Yeah, that is the question.
If it was trained on like a lot of European streets where there's people walking around, maybe it's not used to seeing as many cars.
Right? The data set might have sparser cars. That's a very good point. And actually, that's a very good point. In our current, when I get to the punchline of this, I don't think our model is yet solving that part of the problem, and that's one thing we're working on. Well, this gets to like how much of an expert are you, and how did you know this was the kitty data set when I showed it to you? What defines the kitty data set?
Is the car in the frame?
It's all taken from the same car, and there's the same hood ornament in every image. Now, once you know that, it's not hard to hack up your model to have no inference there or no loss there when you're training it. And if I'm giving the even longer version of this talk, I'll tell you a story about the Name the Dataset Challenge paper that Aliosh Efros and Antonio Torralba once published, where the game was show a bunch of pictures of data sets circa 2012 to a bunch of computer vision researchers, and can you guess the data set that it came from? And like, if you're a good computer vision researcher, you really can, right? Like, Colleen knows which images came from like her PR2 #1 data set versus whatever. And that was the life of a vision researcher back then. Spend your life on these 20 images or something like that. And the point of that paper and the theme of this story is that's bad. If you can just like look at the image and guess what data set it comes from, there's some bias going on there that your model's gonna overfit to. So this is an example of something where, yeah, I mean, if you know ahead of time that this is a problem, you can probably manually engineer your architecture to fix it. But other things like the street signs being different or the weather being different are harder to overcome. So it's nice to have this fully automatic story for learning to generalize, here that we're calling domain adversarial training. And here it's baked into a semantic segmentation paradigm. And so, as I said, we're training on cityscapes, we're testing on San Francisco, and you can get significant, like there's no airport scene like this in the cityscapes data, so it gets a lot of it wrong. It gets less of it wrong after this adaptation story. You can also look at synthetic environments. I'm going to skip this. And here I'm going to, where is the result slide that shows it getting better? Did that just disappear in my deck? I apologize for that. There should have been a result slide that shows that this scene actually gets better. So trust me that it does. It doesn't get perfect. Basically a lot of this goes away, but there's still a little bit left, and it gets a little tighter on those things. it's a lot like the improvement from here to here, from here to here. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but it works on synthetic data. And I'm going to come back to more examples of, so here, instead of going from one real data set to another real data set, we're going to go from synthetic computer graphics data to cityscapes data. And again, like and this is, why is this appealing? I mean, we have a lot of labeled data for recognizing pixels, but we don't have a lot of data for driving dynamics. So there's this general idea that if we could actually just learn how, if robots could learn to act in simulated environments, they'd probably then be able to go act in the real world. And that's, and you'll hear more about that from future speakers. It's still a bit hard, right? Actually, there's a bit of a struggle. Somehow when people train models on computer graphics rendering, they don't just work always. And here's an example of why. So, right, so here's, okay, so I don't, we'll get the punchline in a few slides, but if you we'll get the numbers in a few slides, but the punchline is, if you train on synthetic data and then try and do inference on test data, it's surprisingly poor, right? It's like it makes a lot of mistakes. So we're going to do the same thing of, can we actually, using this domain confusion idea, re-render or find a representation in which these things are aligned, or equivalently, hallucinate what this domain image would look like in this domain image. Okay? And remember what I told you about the defining characteristics of this domain. Like I've already pointed out one of them, that it's got a Daimler hood ornament. Another one is that it's all from nice Central European German cities, right? Like what doesn't make sense here? Like, where's this from? Greater Los Angeles, or whatever the GTA world is. And so what wouldn't you expect to see? First of all, what are the differences? Look at this nice German asphalt. Does it look like this? No. What else is different?
There are palm trees.
You've seen me give this talk before.
The brighter colors.
Yeah, the color, the sensor, the virtual sensor saturation is much different. Sunnier, yeah. So, so we run our model to, just like we went from Street View house numbers to MNIST. Now we go from GTA to Street View, and oops, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. So this is the source image, and now this is the re-rendered source image. And I'll just jump back and forth. And like all those things you mentioned, like the color saturation changes, look what happened. It hallucinates a hood ornament, not in the right place. And I mean, that tells us there's still some structural aspects of our, like if we use a self-attention GAN now, maybe we would solve that problem. Please don't go do that. That's what I want to go do. And the color saturation change, there's still, still some crap going on here. And as Colleen pointed out, look what happened to the palm trees. They turned into pine trees, right? And that we didn't program that into this model. That model, the model learned this just by learning how to transform images from source to target. So that's cool. And here's going backwards, taking a video from cityscapes and re-rendering it to make it look like it's in GTA. And here's the proof in the pudding that I should have teased earlier with some numbers. We're training with GTA data and then testing on cityscapes. I'm sorry, I've been referring to Kitty. I think I should have been referring to cityscapes. My apologies. That's right. This is all, every time I said Kitty, I should have said cityscapes. They're both German data sets of car imagery that people have done this work on. Here's what the ground truth of this test image was. no cityscapes labels were harmed in training of this algorithm or were used in the training of this algorithm. And if you just, as I said, took the source model for GTA and ran it on this image, that's the results you would get. And it's actually quite poor. And if you do our adaptation scheme, this is the result that you get. And a lot of things are much better, just highlighting the detail of that person outline there, small object, and another small object. And if you look quantitatively, it's a similar story as before. The source performance, actually these numbers are sometimes, this number looks much better than it is. And in some sense, this number looks worse than it is. But if you just go on these numbers, we're about 2/3 of the way to solving this. So that's the sort of domain adaptation story. Question?
Yeah, it seems like this adaptation is changing mostly sort of texture and pixel level things, whereas some of the difference, or maybe a lot of the difference between the data sets is like in a German town, there's buildings on both sides of the roads.
Yep.
But it seems like you're still doing a lot better. But do you think that's another big part of it?
Another big part of future work? Yeah. I mean, it's not the case that it's only doing texture, because it's putting that, I don't know, do you call the hood ornament texture?
Sure. Yeah.
Halfway. So, but I think that's exactly right, that the model is basically just doing texture resynthesis. And as we get to a more complete model that can have complete structural resynthesis and say, maybe in one domain, people are always walking their bikes. And in the other domain, people are all riding their bikes. And a model that can actually do that complete re-rendering, which I don't think there's any theoretical reason we wouldn't be able to get that working. I don't know if this model, the current model, would achieve that. So, but certainly something where you say, like, there are always cars on the right-hand side of the road in one domain, parked on the right-hand side of the road in one domain, always parked on the left-hand side of the road in another domain. That's going to be tough for the current architecture, I think, to handle. But I think an ultimate architecture should be able to handle that. So, all right, so I burned an hour on the first half of my talk. I'm going to just assume that we're done with questions on adaptation. You got the story. So I'm going to do the last half hour on explainable AI. And there's like two different big flavors of explainable AI. There's modularity and introspection and like models that learn to reason, quote unquote, and that I can debug by taking them apart. And then there's like justification-based models that basically tell stories about what their training data thought was going on. And so why do we want to do this? Well, especially with deep learning, it's classically frustrating. I mean, you guys are all taking this seminar, so you must like deep learning, right? But then there's, it's irritating that it's this large undifferentiated mass of connections. We don't really know what's going on. And the theories we have are interesting, but don't constrain the real world or often predict performance as much as we'd hope. And when users are in the loop, users might want to actually know that this thing knows what it's doing or figure out what it's doing. Or when you're debugging it, you might want to have more handles on debugging it. How do we make deep learning more explainable and more trustworthy? And there's this like notional diagram that right now you get to choose. Do you want a system that works really well? This might be a deep learning algorithm. Or is explainable. I can interpret it or understand it. Maybe this is like a decision tree or a sparse linear model, or just a rule, a heuristic, a rule, an old expert system. Like when I see a human, I should stop the car, or turn left at the intersection when there's a green light. Those are interpretable. It's very useful. But as I think we see with contemporary autonomous driving systems, they don't work as well as things that actually are trained on large amounts of data. And certainly we never were able to recognize cats on the internet or even anywhere using rules that we would write down. A face is comprised of two eyes located above a nose. That rule doesn't work. And so, but these learning-based systems work, but they're kind of uninterpretable. So one might want to try and build new algorithms that push this out. But ultimately, we'd like my last part of the animation that didn't show up, which is, or maybe it's coming in the following slide. So if nothing else, we should do this, right? Like, we can take deep learning methods and add explainability to them, and that's what I'm about to show you. But I also argue and think we're about to be able to show that the points will go up, right? Because adding explainability to a deep model is just adding more loss to it. It's just saying not only do you have to perform on task, but you also have to provide explanations for, or generalizations for why you think you did what you did. So there's no I mean, it might go down, but it could also go up. There's no reason to think that explainability is a trade-off with regards to performance that's always going in the wrong direction. So we have two themes. One is modularity. This is a big project that several faculty are involved in. I'm not going to go through all the citations and names, but colleagues at several universities. One approach is modularity, where we want to take a deep network and make it have structure. Another approach is justification, which is, and in both of these, it's like the story is the solution to interpretable deep learning is more deep learning. Here we're going to use deep learning to force modularity onto an architecture, or to find a modular architecture to solve a task. Here we're going to have an underlying deep learning network that does something, and I'm going to have another deep learning network that looks at the first deep learning network and tells a story, maybe in natural language, about why something happened. Now, this first kind of explainability is it makes a lot of sense, especially from a computer science perspective. I'd like to be able to debug my model. I'd like it to be causal. Like, if I'm building something that's going to count the number of cars on a street, and say whether it's an even or an odd number of cars, I'd like to maybe first have something that finds cars, and then something that counts things. And I'd like to have an interface between them and see whether, was it the counting thing that broke, or was it the car finding thing that broke? Whereas this justification approach might be like, well, why is Colleen's water bottle empty? It's empty. I don't know. I mean, and maybe I could ask you, why is Colleen's water bottle empty? And you could say, I think she forgot to fill it up on the way in. Or maybe she drank it earlier, right? Are those, I mean, I don't know if they're correct explanations, but they're plausible explanations. Or if you were an expert bird labeler, and I've got some species of bird here, you tell me this is a certain kind of bird, and you tell me why. I can think of, I don't really know if that's what was going on in your brain, but it's still a useful explanation as sort of a cognitive science or human-computer interface level. And I could ask a machine to also predict that. Not only predict the label of the bird, or whether Colleen's water bottle is full or empty, but also to tell me a story about why you think that's the case. Maybe it should be more like, why do you think Colleen's water bottle is empty? Because I don't see any water in it. That's kind of a silly explanation. There's my curve. Okay, good. And this is applicable broadly. So the first class of techniques that I'm going to explain, and you'll hear a little bit more about this actually when Colleen talks next week, because she's going to expand this in the robotics domain. But I'm today just going to talk about it in the vision and language domain. It's this idea of modularity or neural modular networks. This is a line of work that Jacob Andreas, Dan Klein, Rongheng Hu, and others have explored here in my lab and other labs at Berkeley. And it's the idea that instead of having a single deep network solve a task, can we have a deep network that has modularity in it? Right? Can we say that these networks are performing a task, and the task has some compositional structure to it, and we're going to focus on vision and language tasks. How many people are familiar already with VQA, vision and language? Question, raise your hand if you're not. How many people have seen image captioning before? So image captioning, everyone was excited I could take a ConvNet and a language model, stick them together, put an image in, get a caption out. It's still, is it a good answer or not? So that drove the community to say, let's try and really, because someone who criticized that model's not really understanding what's going on in the image. It's just glossing over it. It's just detecting a few objects. So visual question answering is, I have an arbitrary image, or somewhat arbitrary image. I have a human that asks a question about that image, generates questions for the image, and I have another human that generates answers for those questions that the first human produced. And that gives me a data set. And I actually see whether machine vision systems can then look at the image, look at the question, and give you the right answer. And it's potentially completely open domain. So that's the background. And there's realistic challenges. You'll see some of the examples coming through. But for now, we're looking at these synthetic toy variants just to unpack what's going on, and specifically to focus on modularity and compositionality. Because you'd think that you couldn't solve open domain VQA just with nearest neighbors. I mean, geez, I hope not, right? We don't really want our deep networks just to be doing nearest neighbors. But they often are. I mean, and depending on who's giving you the lecture, nearest neighbors are cool. They work really well. Like, actually, that's pretty much often the best you can do is the right kind of nearest neighbors. That's what Alyosha will probably tell you at some point. But for this, we want to say it's not just nearest neighbors. The network is actually decomposing a problem into structural components where maybe each little structural component is doing nearest neighbors. But when I learn what it is to be red or a circle, I'm going to reuse that little module in a different component. And here, instead of having so we want to have compositionality, and we want to leverage the fact that the task structure, which in this VQA sense is given to us from the language, has compositional structure. So is there a red shape above a circle? And this is where our earliest work in this line started. We assumed we had a sentence, and we assumed the sentence had a natural parse. And that parse, the semantic parse, would actually give us the kind of plan or program to solve the task. That, well, to find is there a red shape above a circle? Well, let's first find for circles and then red things and compare them whether they're above. If it's a shape, then you yes or no, right? So that gives us little programs, and different questions would give us different programs. And the first results in our neural modular networks line of work showed that you could train these models just like regular neural nets. Like the fact that the architecture, so this literally means that the architecture of the net changes with every instance. And these are all little neural nets. But that's still okay that it changes with every instance because the parameters are still linked. So there's nothing in deep learning that says the network has to be the same shape at every instance to have it work. You can have dynamic networks as we showed in this paper. And as we showed in this paper, the model will then be more sample efficient and able to learn the kinds of modular structures or compositional properties that you're interested in. It'll learn that's a circle, and then it'll reuse whatever it is that makes a circle in other contexts as it learns. And when it learns, each question has a different architecture, but the parameters are tied across all of them. So it's not the complete parameter tying of a regular traditional network, but it's enough to actually learn. And and it's actually not that hard to learn with those fixed layouts. Okay. Everyone got that so far?
Wait, so you put the blocks together and then train the network instead of training the blocks individually to do their assigned tasks?
They're all trained at the same time. It's all jointly trained. And it gets more fun as we go through the next few iterations of this, because this first one just said, assume a parser, an externally trained parser, gives me this layout, right? So it is pretty easy to learn with fixed layouts, right? Now what gets more interesting is can we actually optimize over the layouts, or even learn without any access to a parser at all? And that's what we'll get to. So we upgraded from that first paper, from that kind of synthetic environment, to a different kind of synthetic environment, which our friends at Stanford had created really to try and test these methods. So this is called the Clever data set. And an actual sample from the Clever data set is this question and this image. And I would venture to say it'll take you a little bit of time to figure out the answer. And you probably wouldn't use nearest neighbors to solve this. This is not like a pre-attentive recognition task where you would say, is it a green ball or a red ball? Red ball. No, how many other things are of the same size as the green matte ball? Okay, takes me a while to come up with an answer. And so I don't want to just do this. Right? I don't want to have a single monolithic network that's arguably just nearest neighbors on steroids regressing this answer for me. I would prefer to have something that first says, I've got to find a green matte ball. I've got to go and see what are the other things that are the same size, and then I should count. And then I'd like to be able to look and see what's happening along those links and have that thing then tell me 4. And I would both argue that in the long run, this should be a better approach to AI and generalize better and be more compositional with other tasks and so on and so forth. And importantly for this part of the talk, this is more interpretable and explainable. That like, if I show you this, and I will show you an example of that actually coming out of the algorithm, you feel like you understand what it's doing more than this. So that's one, this is one version of explainability, and I'm hoping to still have 10 minutes for the other version. So here's how this is our ICCV 17 paper, and there's a latest update which will be presented at ECCV next week that I'll get to in a few slides. It has these primitive modules that have a certain type, and they're grounded in the original text, and they take an image as input. So our system first learns that the first thing to do to solve this, given this question, the first thing to do is to find the green matte ball. And so it does that. And it can even visualize the output of that module. The output of that module is a heat map. And then it also learns, or has been shown similar training data in one version of the system, that the next thing it should do is relate and find, essentially, or relate things that are the same size. So what else in the image is the same size as that thing that I just put in? And then it outputs another heat map. And then the last thing it does is count. Given that second heat map, how many things are there? And the answer is 4. So this is what, and there are plenty of other examples we can go through. And what I like about this work is that we called it learning to reason. And what we like about it is it harkens back to a very old idea in computer vision that I remember when I was a grad student, which is this notion of visual routines, right? It's not a lot, and it's the interplay of active vision or purposive or robotic vision, to use some other old terms, where we can't just do things with nearest neighbors or regression all the time. We have to decide what to do. We have to apply different processing tasks, and that's going to be useful for a variety of reasons. But data efficiency and interpretability are 2 of them. And in this most recent version that's ECCV paper next week, I don't have time to go into it, but there's the most strongest version of the model. It's now actually essentially a little processor that iterates over a weighting of these different compositional elements and decides, as a question is given, it takes a bunch of question features, it takes the image, gets a bunch of image features, runs the question through a little RNN, which tries to predict what sequence of things to do. It's this kind of, there's related to the ideas of neural Turing machines and things like that, if you're familiar with those lines of work, decides, well, first, which thing should I do? And then go ahead and do it. And then it has a stack of these intermediate computation elements. And at the end of the day, it can take an image like this and a question, there's a small gray block, are there any spheres to the left of it? And it says, okay, the way I solved that is I first went and found a small gray block, then I did the left transform, then I said, are any of those spheres? And then I kind of did a no-op, and then I answered the question yes. And similarly, if I'm saying, find me the cyan thing that is made of the same material as the yellow object, I first find the yellow object, transform the material, filter the cyan. That's again a little bit of a no-op. And then I think these programs had to have the same number of steps. That's why there's sometimes a no-op in them. And so the good news is these models work well, and they actually are more accurate than baseline methods. The bad news is at the same time or in parallel, other people have built like nearest neighbor methods that are even better. So on pure accuracy, like the clever data set was sort of solved with some outer product nearest neighbor hack. But for interpretability, it's still like much more interpretable than other techniques, and that's what humans will say. So this is the first line of work, which is let's take a deep network and let's try and make it compositional and make it something that has internal structure and that this is a useful thing. And so we'll see this. You've seen it here in vision and language. And next week, I think if Colleen wants to speak about it, I think she's going to show off some of the similar ideas that she's developed in robotics, where you can be building an end-to-end deep model that tries to put the peg in the hole, but learning a completely separate deep model for every shape of peg and every shape of hole isn't that compelling a way to go. And so it's nice to say that your your solution might have modularity. I have some network elements corresponding to my pegs, and some corresponding to my holes, and that's sort of the story that Colleen has developed and some of her earlier work. So that was half the explanation story. That was this half. Now here's the other half, and we have about 10 minutes. So the other half says, forget about structural modularity necessarily. I'm not going to actually. I'm still going to have a deep network, and I have no idea what's going on inside of it. I'm not going to try too hard. But I'm just going to connect another deep network onto the end of it and see if I can tell stories in language and text and maybe attentive visualizations with what's going on in that first network. So it's maybe treating the network as a black box, but trying to post hoc provide rationalizations of what's going on in that black box. So I'll try and interpret this for you. Maybe I have some visual question answering model that says, can I park here? And a computer vision model, or the vision and language model looks at it, predicts the answer is no, and also predicts, because of other training data that it had on this, looking at the output and the intermediate structure, no parking because there's a red curb, and it can also visualize the salience of what pixels led to this prediction and highlight that. So that salience step is debatable. We could probably characterize it either as this kind of model or this kind of model. But this part, where I'm just telling a story of what the other experts who performed that task did, that's post hoc rationalization. And we build that off of this old work, now old, right, 2015 work, that many groups, including our own, developed on image captioning that involved taking a visual representation on images or on a video in this case, and just building a model that can end-to-end output a caption or a narration or literally a translation, because this is like a sequence-to-sequence translation model of the ConvNet, of the CNN features coming in and saying a dog jumps over a fence and so on and so forth. This is all fully supervised. There's a corpus of training data, hopefully with animals and dogs in it, and hopefully with some animals jumping over other things, right? This is supervised learning here. But we want to have it. We want explanations. We don't want captions. Captions are things that are relevant to an image, period. They're great. Explanations are relevant to the image, but they're also relevant to a task. And like the definition of the task is certainly relevant to the task, like the definition of what makes a certain bird species. But you don't. When I'm explaining why I think this is a certain bird species, I don't want to tell you stuff that's not on the image, and I don't want to tell you stuff that's not relevant to the task. So here, a caption, this would be a pretty good caption for this image, but it's not that good of an explanation of why this is a certain type of bird. This is a good definition, but it's not telling you much about what's in the image. And so this is a better visual explanation. So we try and train vision and language systems to generate that kind of text. Again, fully supervised. We have training data where experts have given us the label and they've given us a sentence on why they thought that was the label. So we're just regressing rationales here using a vision and language model. And we have some underlying classifier that's predicting some category. Won't go into details there, but it basically predicts the category. And then we want the text that gets generated to be dependent on the category. I mean, it's already dependent on the image, because that's what an image captioning engine does. So how do we enforce this category constraint? And I'm now showing you the work that's about 2 years old. There's more recent results in the literature, like GAN-based approaches to this training from Fiedler's group in Toronto. But here what we did in I think one of the earliest papers to explore this was just add a discriminative loss on each term. So we have the original relevance loss, which is here. That's essentially the image captioning loss. But now we have a discriminative loss that tries to pump it up to that makes sure these words are relevant to the category. And we just did something here based on, can we actually predict the class from those words? And then it had a novel RL loss, a novel back at the time. Now everyone does that. And that was, I think, 2016. So here are the kinds of results we'd get. And there's not a lot of time, so I'm not going to show you any more of them. The follow-up work, which is also being presented next week, improves the discriminative aspects of that loss further by actually going out and looking at the parts of the explanation that are generated and confirming that they can be grounded visually in the image. Like if we're going to say it's a red bird, if we're going to say this is a certain kind of bird because it's red, has a red beak and a black face, it's really embarrassing if there's no black face in the image. So this version, this idea was to go at least post hoc, you build a re-ranker that would take apart the explanation and kind of make sure every part is in there. And so that was cool. We get, and it also gives us a visual grounding of what's where. I'm gonna skip over this except to say that you can then extend this further to not only say why this is a certain bird, but you can obviously say why isn't it the other bird using the same type of machinery. Generate an explanation for both categories, and then compare, see which ones are there or not. Sorry about this. I think I'm gonna have to skip over the last part. Wow. Yeah, okay, good. And I'm just going to close on, well, okay. There's also one minute on this. There's salience and visualization of what pixels are used for a decision is another part of explanations. So you might say, why is this image being recognized as goldfish? And so these are two state-of-the-art methods for saying which pixels are the pixels that make you think this is a goldfish, and that's probably the better model. And then last but not least, you want to not get too fooled by these things. Or, sometimes when you then visualize what are the pixels that are leading to a decision, you can uncover bias in recognition models. This is another paper that'll be presented at ECCV next week. And I mean, this is the 1-minute version of this talk. And bias is a complicated thing in machine learning, right? If you understand machine learning at any level of theory, you know you need some sort of notion of statistical bias to actually do any inference. But now when we switch to a practical setting, there's some kinds of bias that you have in a data set that you don't want to generalize to a new data set. You really are doing a having a domain adaptation fail if your training data all has certain dependencies where to detect whether this is a man or a woman, it looks at the computer, right? We don't like that. We'd like to have a model for gender, at least if I'm captioning anything, that really, to the extent that we have a notion of visual gender, and that we don't have time to debate that or discuss that, but at least if we're going to refer to gender at all, I feel more comfortable actually referring to the person in the image when I'm referring to gender. And so we built a model that overcomes that kind of, or at least gives control over that kind of bias by saying that for categories where we'd really like to make sure that the person is being attended to in the image, we want our model to have an appearance confusion loss. And there's some connection to the domain adaptation story where we black out all the pixels in the image, and when it's captioning this image, it should be equally likely to use either of the terms that are either man or woman. So that's this idea, that's this equalizer paper that we have. And so that's perhaps one of the reasons why explanations are useful, to understand and visualize what's going on so that maybe you can control unwanted bias. I think I'm out of time. I'll take questions as we let the next class come in. And next week I'll be at ECCV, unfortunately, but Colleen will be here. I think John will be here as well. So thank you. Any questions while we're switching? Feel free to ask me questions in future